In 2004, I was kind of paying attention to what was going on, and that's when we found out that, well, gee, Ohio suddenly flipped in the middle of the night because they sent their numbers off to Tennessee to be counted on a different server, a server controlled by the Republican National Committee. And that just, you know, I couldn't believe. I actually wrote a letter to the editor and said, hey, folks, things got cheated here and it's going to come out. And 3 different people wrote to the Milpitas Post and said, Rob, you were full of beans. And it never came out. It never came out in a big way that there was lying, cheating, and stealing going on with our vote counting. So here I am, you know, 15 years later, and still complaining about it and still not seeing much happening in the real world out there. So I'll do my presentation and then we'll throw it out to you folks to see what comes next. So, after that introduction, here's Rob Means. Let me just hold on to this mic. Let's go to the next slide here. So, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy is a film by Greg Palast. And it's available through all kinds of channels, and it talks about, in particular, interstate cross-check, but it actually covers a lot of the voter suppression techniques that have been used to keep people from voting. The New York Times apparently came up with a video game. They found out that this was such a prevalent thing that and had so many parts and pieces, they made a whole game, and you can go ahead and check that out. I believe there's also on the back of your agenda oh yes, it looks ugly. There's a big long URL, but if you Google it up, you should be able to find the voter suppression trail. And then there's a whole dozen different ways that votes are being stolen in one fashion or another. So first, I'm going to kind of get a feel from the audience as to how many of these you knew about, you kind of heard about, you had an inkling about, something, I think I know about that. So suppressing voter registration, I'm going to describe these first 6 one at a time and ask you, gee, did you hear about that particular form of voter suppression where, for example, in Florida, it's a crime to go out and get somebody to register to vote, and if they put down anything, any mistake on that form, and apparently the mistake can be as minor as writing an AVE period instead of avenue, is a criminal offense. You are guilty of a crime and can be prosecuted. As a result, the League of Women Voters is no longer registering people to vote in the state of Florida. So now, raise your hand, how many of you had an inkling that that was going on? So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, half the, okay, it looks like about a dozen people knew about that one. Caging. Now, let's see if this video thing actually works here. I'm going to give this a shot and see whether it be, now this is actually from the movie, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. Let's see how this works out. I've been having some technical difficulties with the audio, but we'll see how this works out. He's starting, Greg Palast is talking about Karl Rove. That name may be familiar. And a particular email that was sent to him here. Let's see how this works.
From Karl Rove's research chief to George W. Bush's campaign chiefs, titled Caging. The lists were names of voters living at homeless shelters and minority soldiers at the Naval Air Station in Florida. The homeless weren't home, and Bad Penny discovered the sailors were overseas. So I took the thousands of names to a law school dean who explained caging to me.
Caging is a system by which you can target cohorts of voters and get them excluded from the lists. And it's illegal in this country, and it's illegal particularly if it's illegal under a number of statutes, but if you target black or minority voters, it's illegal under the Voting Rights Act of 1965 specifically. It's a felony, and it's punished by high fines, but also imprisonment. The Republican Party has done this in the past. They will get the addresses of the black voters in a particular state. Then they will mail certified letters to to each of those homes. And if the voter is not there at the time that the letter is delivered to accept delivery, the post office will automatically send that letter back to the sender, which in this case is the Republican National Committee. If the letter comes back, the Republican National Committee uses that letter as presumptive evidence that the voter gave a false address on his voting form and is therefore ineligible to vote.
Go to Iraq, lose your vote. Mission accomplished. Caging. It's effective, it's illegal, it's Rove. Now, Rove and his computers have grown up. The simple caging computers have morphed into data trust, hourly tracking over 1,800 things about you, Mr. Voter, including the last time you downloaded porn, to whether you ordered Chinese food just before you voted.
I think that's creepy.
I agree, Mark. Let's see if we can go back to the PowerPoint. So caging. That's where they send out an innocuous piece of literature asking you to return it, and if you don't, then they say, oh, this person's not here, get them off the voting rolls. How many of you all knew about this going on? There's a few of you out there. All righty, great. Let's see what else we've got here on the dirty dozen. It's interstate cross-check. Now this one I'm imagining most everybody certainly, well, yeah, let's just raise our hands. Those of you folks that have heard about it, okay. That's a popular one. And it is really the kind of the main subject of the best democracy money can buy. Chris Kobach has, out of Kansas, I believe, put together a list, and if your name is on that list, even if you live in California, Florida, Ohio, Alaska, it doesn't matter. If your name is on that list of felons from Kansas, you're going to get pulled off the voter rolls in certain states. Now, I mentioned California, and that was a mistake, because California doesn't play this game. But there's a lot of states that do. Reduce the number of polling places and times. So you may have heard about, say, long voter lines. How about, anybody heard about long voter lines? Great, yes. You know, those are not an accident. Those are deliberate. They happen when a polling place gets a reduced number of voting machines, or they get the right number of voting machines, but the voting machines break down somehow, mysteriously, conveniently. And that those people in those areas, those polling areas, just don't get their votes, don't get to vote unless they're willing to stand in line in the cold for about 4 hours. So the next one, the polling place got moved. Let's see, I think that we've got, let's see, the reduced number of polling places, okay, I'm not going to go there. That's another trick. So they don't advise you until the last minute, like the day of, when you go down to the polling place and you see a sign that says, oh, your polling place is no longer here, it's way over there across town, 10 miles away. How many people knew that that kind of stuff was going on? Okay, hey, there's a few folks who knew about that. Intimidation at the polls. Rehnquist, he was a Supreme Court justice. He made his chops back in the early 60s by going to polling places. He's like 6'2", big guy, and he would intimidate people at the polls. And some of them would actually leave the line and go home rather than deal with being harassed or threatened with some kind of a lawsuit of some sort. Anybody heard about intimidation at the polls? Yeah, we've got a few out here that have heard about that stuff. Whoa, she's got both hands up back there. She's really pissed off about that one. Whoa, how did I get shortage and broken lines on there twice? Well, not certain how that happened, but we'll skip right past that one and go to the selective voter IDs. So in certain states, if you have a concealed weapon carry permit, that is a legitimate form of identification that you can use when you go to vote. If you have a college ID, that's not. If you have half a dozen others that just kind of put you into these categories of old or young or infirmed, people that generally tend to vote Democratic, your identification may not be valid. How about a driver's license? If you're old, you may not have a driver's license. If you're inner city, you may not have a driver's license. How about if you don't have a driver's license, but you want to get a driver's license? Well, we can fix that problem too by closing the DMV in your area. Anybody hear about that selective ID stuff? Okay, there's a few of you out there for that too. Residence required. This is a new one to me. You don't get to use a P.O. box. You actually have to have a physical residence. So those older folks that are retired, snowbirds we call them in some areas, that are on the road, also termed nomads, those folks don't have a permanent residence. How about the homeless? We wouldn't want the homeless voting either, would we? Residence required. Who heard about this barrier to voting here? Oh, just a few of you. Yeah, okay. Electronic voter lists hacked. So when you go to the voting polling place, they usually have a written hard copy, and you sign your name next to your name, and that is the polling, the list of voters in that polling place. Well, apparently they're starting to shift over to electronic versions of that. They're not using the hard copy any longer. And apparently those are being hacked by the Russians. So, you know, we heard this stuff about Russians doing some kind of hacking or some kind of something going on with the Russians. And I haven't followed it closely enough. But apparently that's the place that they are hacking, is into these electronic voter lists and pulling off, I don't know what they pull off, but if they like Trump and they'd like to have him get elected, I would imagine they'd be pulling off voters that have a D after their name here. How many folks heard about the electronic voter lists being hacked? There's well, yeah, this was a pretty educated group here. Ballot spoilage and provisional ballots. So let's try to break out of this and go back to Palast here.
The souls at the polls did not get ballots.
If you're just arriving, come on in, have a seat. Look for Frank. He's wearing the tie. He'll get you seated.
They got a number to wait for this instead. These are applications for absentee ballots. But they're not absent. They're right here at the legal poll. Then they got mail-in ballots and envelopes to put them in. Using an absentee ballot is playing bingo with your vote.
Number 175 and under. 175 and under can head up the steps. Stay to the left as you exit 175 and under.
The nasty secret of American democracy is that over 1 million absentee ballots are rejected, never counted. Is this ballot switcheroo even legal? I drove through the night with one of these pseudo ballots to Ohio's capital, and at midnight, I reached the home of law professor Robert Fitrakis. He was crazy enough to let me in. I showed him what they were giving black voters.
Every early voter, almost all of them African Americans, were handed an absentee ballot. Is that common practice here?
Absolutely uncommon. And I would suspect it's either done out of incompetence, for convenience, or to defraud people of their vote. You vote absentee, they can pick through the absentee and say they didn't fill this out all the way, they didn't sign here, you know, they didn't initial there, and thus toss the absentee. Essentially, they're treating the absentee like a second-class provisional ballot. None of that could be done in regular early voting.
But the state did it anyway. I didn't have the heart to tell them that their ballots may never get counted. In fact, over 2 million ballots, not just absentees, are cast and not counted. That's official. They call it spoilage. How do votes spoil? Not by leaving them out on the fridge. There are 10 ways to spoil your vote or wipe away your registration. Think you're registered? This election, over 3 million of you will find your registration go poof. They toss out your mail-in ballot because you've used the wrong envelope. for postage due, forgot to add your middle initial, fly poop on the ballot, or you didn't fill in the bubble.
We've been invited into the home of voters whose votes didn't count.
Did not fill in the bubble.
So why didn't you fill in the bubble?
'Cause I didn't know when you fill in a name that you had to put a bubble in.
Mom, it said you had to put it in the fill in the bubble.
I'm sorry.
What do you want to know?
Your sister and I did not draw black circles.
She's an ex-school teacher.
Greg Palast's mom didn't have her vote counted because she didn't fit in the right bubble. Okay, let's go back to the presentation here. And slideshow, start from current slide. Ballot spoilage and provisional ballots. Folks probably heard about that. How many of you heard about, you know about this stuff here? Whoa, are you getting tired putting your hands up, or these folks didn't know about this? And then, of course, there's my favorite, rigged vote counting machines. Let's say you get through all of that. You actually get a vote or a voting machine that you get to vote on, and your vote doesn't get counted properly. Now, it seems really a very straightforward, simple thing to do, is to count, oh, you voted for this person. That's a 1 vote for them. It's not 0.9 votes. It's not 1.1 votes. So what would you need fractionalized vote counts for? Well, that's the new game in town. Fractionalized voting, and there's a whole section on that also, that now they can go to the machine and say, okay, you know, we're just going to shift things around based on fractions so it says what we want it to say. Rigged vote counting machines. Let me just read this to you. This is your standard Dilbert thing. We've got the pointy-haired boss who is real self-centered. And he says, we want a contract to write software for voting machines. Who do you want to be president? Says the techie programmer. Why do you ask? Because I want you to be happy. You're implying that you plan to fudge the system. I'm not implying anything like that. Obviously, it will be easy to fudge the data, and we are far happier when you're in a good mood. But I would never commit a crime just because it's good for me and totally undetectable. Okay, good. So, who do you want to win and by how much? 2002 congressional election in Comal County in Texas, election officials noticed an extreme oddity after the final votes were tallied in Tuesday's general election. Quote, 3 winning candidates each received 18,181 votes. The odds? Astronomical. This was my red flag, folks. That was also the year that Governor Don Siegelman lost his re-election due to some 15,000 votes that were suddenly discovered in the middle of the night in one particular precinct by Republican operative folk. He went on to, in fact, I would draw your attention again to the back of the agenda. It's got something about Don Siegelman in there. Yes, no, where'd it go? What, you didn't make it to this list? Yes, there it is, right smack dab in the middle, right after Let America Vote, saga of Don Siegelman. How the South's only progressive governor became America's #1 political prisoner. Prisoner. Not only a prisoner, but he was thrown into solitary confinement, which is defined as a crime against humanity. What is that? A torture, as torture, solitary confinement. Because he complained about what had happened overnight. 2004, Ohio, in the middle of the night, suddenly flips to Bush when the votes were... Somehow they couldn't count them in Ohio. They had to send them down to Tennessee to be counted. And there's many, many more examples on meansfordemocracy.org. And let me do one thing here. Let me jump out one more time. And I'm going to take you over to meansfordemocracy.org. This is what you're going to see on the home page. And if you click on the Rigged Elections button, that'll take you over here, where you can find a whole bunch of information that supports what we're talking about tonight. I'm going to point out a couple of things in particular. This supplemental information here is essentially about a 20-page document that cites lots of examples, books written on the subjects, movies on the subjects, a number of different other background materials. Oh yes, and the probably 5, 10, maybe even 12 different organizations that are working on the rigged vote counting machine problem. Also here, we'll come back to this 2-minute audio, and then there's also this PowerPoint presentation is also got on a link down here, right there it says slideshow. So by following that link on the home page of meansfordemocracy.org, you'll be able to catch up with some of the information and fill in some of the details. So let's go back to our slideshow, starting from the current slide. 2016 Democratic primary rigged? You mean the one between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, that one? Well, if you take a look at the numbers, you're going to find that states with paper trails were real close to the actual results. The poll said, hey, 48% was going to go with Clinton, and 49% was the actual numbers that came out of the totals. But when you go to those states with unaccountable voting machines, the polls indicated that Clinton was going to get like 56%, but the machine said she got 65%. That is a 9-point spread. Anybody that knows anything about polls, exit polls, knows that when you're right on top of the election, they are excellent at predicting what's going to happen. We don't seem to have that in this country any longer because they went south right after Hava and these electronic voting machines came in and started making liars out of the polls. Now in countries that don't have electronic voting machines, like say Germany, not an issue. Now the votes don't get counted for up to 2 or 3 weeks because they hand count the paper ballots. But everybody knows pretty much who the heck won and by how much because the exit polls that night, right after the polls closed, told them who won. And the exit polls are usually accurate to within about 0.5%, certainly within 1%, certainly not a 9-point spread. So those of us who voted for Bernie got screwed by electronic voting machines. Who else got screwed? How about John Ossoff? And anybody that contributed to his campaign with time or money, because a lot was poured in. That was the most expensive congressional campaign in the history of the entire country, and John Ossoff still supposedly lost that election. Now let's go through this. Vote by mail ballots, generally speaking, go heavily Republican. You know, they're a little more conservative, they're less procrastinators like us Democrats that kind of got a lot of balls in the air. So the Republicans are usually out there in force doing that mail-in ballot stuff. Now, in those ballots, those hard copy paper, you can count them again ballots, John Ossoff was running away with the election, 64 to 36%. That's almost a 2-to-1 margin. But Karen Handel seems to have won in that election from the polling place ballots. Those polling places use electronic voting machines with no paper ballots or trail. This is the killer for me. Because no matter how many hurdles you get through to cast your vote, somebody can just flip your vote. So no matter how much the Democratic Party works to get people registered to vote and get them out to vote, it just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter in those red states where they control the voting machines, the electronic voting machines. The non-response of the Democratic leadership. So I figured, after the Ossoff campaign, or the election that was so obviously skewed that, there would be a big Democratic National Committee response to it, but no. In 2006, Tom Hartman asked the Democratic Party officials about it, and here's the short story. I'm going to give you the 2-minute audio, but basically he said that they don't want to talk about redshift because it will cause people to doubt the integrity of our election system, and it will cause them not to come and vote. Don't give people the bad news because it might scare them. Now that logic is currently being used to avoid talking about how serious our global warming situation is, which, if you're not aware, is extremely serious. If we don't do something very big, very quickly, we're going to lose it because we're getting past all the tipping points. But let's go take a listen to Tom Hartman and see whether that audio comes out any better than the others that we've been doing here. And we would do that by going through meansfordemocracy.org and going over here. I'm going to turn volumes down here because I got a feeling that this might be different. Let's give this a click.
David in Woodland Hills, California. Hey, David, what's on your mind?
Thank you, Guru. I read that New Yorker article about global warming, and it was devastating.
Yes, I agree. It's New York Magazine, by the way.
Yeah. I knew 80 to 90% of it, and it's still devastating. But I made a connection I hadn't made before, that the scientists were so cowed by the blowback from the billionaires that they deliberately downplayed their predictions for fear they wouldn't be believed. It would be fantasy stuff. And it's the same thing the Democrats did when they didn't talk about voter suppression for fear that people wouldn't vote.
It's so strange that you bring that up, because I had this exact conversation with an old and dear friend of mine. Earl is his first name. We were literally in email yesterday. And we were talking about this, this idea that we shouldn't scare people about, bad climate scenarios. And I said, I remember back in 2005, 2006, coming to Washington, D.C. and meeting with a half a dozen fairly high-profile elected members of Congress. And it was me and 4 or 5 other people from Air America Radio. It was when Air America was doing well. And, several of us brought up, me and as I recall, Randy Rhodes, brought up the issue of electronic voting machines and redshift, and how it looked like the machines were being hacked by the Republican Party because all this redshift stuff started just in particular states, just in the swing states, just in the battleground states, and just after the machines were installed. And what we were told by these elected Democrats was, we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about redshift. We don't want to talk about electronic voting machines. It'll cause people to doubt the integrity of our election system, and that will cause them not to come and vote. So don't give them the bad news, because it might scare them. And I thought it was a stupid argument at the time. I still think it's a stupid argument, and I think applying that same argument to climate change is equally stupid. And David, all I can say is great minds think alike. Me and Earl having this conversation, you calling in and saying the exact same thing to me. I'm with you. I'm totally with you. So, David, thank you for the call.
About this point, I started getting a little irritable. Excuse me? 10 years ago, you knew about it and you didn't want to do anything about it? And what's happened in the last 10 years? Moving right along. What's happened in the last 10 years? Well, let's just look at the last election, maybe. For example, where over 1 million voters were removed from registration lists, interstate cross-check kind of stuff. 21 million. Now this is the number that really kind of surprised me. I had no idea that so many people were basically blocked from voting because they didn't have the right voter ID. So that's 22 million voters. And we can definitely count on most of those being for Hillary Clinton. And then, of course, there's these numbers I don't have, but you can just kind of guess on your own how many millions of votes were switched by rigged vote counting machines. If we are looking at a 9-point spread in Georgia, they might be doing 3, 4, 5, 6, 9% in other red states. And we're going to be talking lots of millions there. How about the millions of eligible voters that were thwarted by all these other techniques of voter suppression? Now Bernie Sanders says that the current model and the current strategy of the Democratic Party is an absolute failure. Now let's see if I can find the longer quote that he had here. And I think this is it down here. Oh, there it is. Democrats have lost the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate. Republicans now control almost 2/3 of the governor's chairs throughout the country. And over the last 9 years, Democrats have lost almost 1,000 legislative seats in states all across the country. Today, in almost half of the states in America, Democratic Party has almost no political presence at all. Now, if that's not a failure, if that's not a failed model, I don't know what a failed model is. So, I tend to agree with him. Let's go back to our presentation. What's next? Well, let's see. We talked about the voter suppression stuff, 22 plus million out of 136 million votes. Now, again, here's areas I don't have numbers for, but I got a feeling that 22 plus whatever millions of voters may be a bit more significant in the whole playing of our elections than gerrymandering, than the DNC's messaging and strategy in the last campaign, than the effects of even big donor and dark money. Now, I may get some objections on that one because big donors and dark money is a big deal. I'm working on it myself through the move to amend effort to get a constitutional amendment that says, oh, no, Supreme Court. Money is not speech, and corporations are not people, and we should be able to regulate both. But we don't know how big an impact that's happening. And then, of course, there's the lamestream media bias and the news-free reports that they generate. And again, you know, we don't know exactly, we can't put any hard numbers on that, but those are also factors playing in this game. So, let's go to responses rather than non-responses. The California Democratic Party. So this is an excerpt from a resolution that was passed by the California Democratic Party this past August at their executive board meeting. The California Democratic Party urges the Democratic National Committee to demand that our elections be fully transparent, verifiable, and routinely audited. Now, the Democratic Party is working on gerrymandering. You may have heard that ex-President Obama, why do we label him now? He's president forever, right? Kind of thing, okay. President Obama is working the gerrymandering issue. They're also working on low voter turnout. But there are no efforts to enforce the Voting Rights Act or to re-enfranchise those 21, 22 million voters nationwide that have been kicked off the rolls. That seems a weak strategy to me. Fortunately, we've got a couple of folks in Congress, Mark Polkan being one of the ones that I'm familiar with. He has submitted 2 pieces of legislation. One is called the Securing America's Future Elections Act. And that act, H.R. 1562, would tighten up all the electronic voting machine stuff and make sure there's a paper trail and make sure things are verifiable. This would be a winner if we could get this one passed. The Voter Roll Integrity Act takes care of the interstate cross-check problem. And that's H.R. 3091. So we've got pending legislation, kind of like we have pending legislation for a single-payer healthcare system at the national level that Bernie introduced this week. But we need to get it passed somehow. So, possible responses include Democrats, community legal organizations, and the left, that could flood the courts with Voter Rights Act cases. Now, we may not win a lot of those cases, but just bringing them to light is enough to kind of get a little publicity around this issue. This particular club gave money to the Ossoff campaign. That's the campaign where the voting machines ripped us off? Well, hey, if we got ripped off, do we have grounds for filing lawsuit? I don't know. I'm just throwing this one out here. This is one of those wild and crazy Rob ideas. But I think that we've got grounds to sue somebody over something, it seems. How about crowdfunding? Paper ballot voting in parallel with those unverifiable voting machines. Partly as a way of advertising the problem and partly as a way of setting things up for the lawsuit that happens 5 minutes after they report the numbers from those electronic voting machines. We may actually be able to keep Republican congressmen who are elected by electronic voting machines from going to Congress because we can tie the thing up in court. Don't know? Just throwing the idea out. How about mobilizing long-term, consistent, direct action and media attention, all directed to this whole vote theft issue? Now, there's an organization newly established called LetAmericaVote.org, and that is part of their game plan. They're going to make, those folks that are dealing in these issues, they're going to give them a little more heat. More possible responses. So now the California Democratic Party Progressive Caucus, Karen Bernal is the chairman of that, and she uses a phrase, make beautiful trouble. I like that phrase so much I had to put it into this speech here. There's the obvious things we can do, because a lot of people are simply unaware of how all of so many elections have been rigged. So we can distribute informational flyers at events, well, maybe events like this, or other things. We can ask about the issues in public forums with legislators and democracy movement speakers. Move to amend, Disclose Act, Best Democracy Money Can Buy. These are all pieces of the democracy movement. Those of us, true Americans, that understand that this country was founded on the idea of democracy, are real keen on democracy. And we want to see democracy happen, we want to see it working, we want to see it effective. And if it's not, then we need to be involved in making it happen. So there's a democracy movement out there, there's some speakers floating around talking about various pieces of the picture, and we could go to those forums and ask about these voter suppression or rigged vote counting machine issues. Or in private lobbying efforts with your legislators. Trump was elected with vote theft. We, the people, have a massive complaint against the existing system, and we really need to voice that massive complaint. Here's another possibility. So recently in this club, an affordable housing committee was created. We've got a number of committees doing a variety of things, whether it's these programs get created out of a committee. We've got a precinct captain committee, I think this goes by a different name, but there's a number of committees within this club that are doing stuff to make democracy work better. Maybe there's 6 to 12 volunteers in the audience that would like to actually create an election integrity committee. So if you would, give us, contact us either through the website would probably be the best bet for finding how to contact us. That's democraticclub-scc.org. And of course, if you provide your name, phone number, and email address, we can get back to you and say, oh, there were only 2 people that responded. Or, yeah, we had 7 or 8 people, and we're going to get you all connected, and hopefully you'll start that election integrity committee on your own. Come on down to our e-board and talk to us about it. Resources. There's meansfordemocracy.org again, and that link, Rigged Elections, which has the CDP resolution that was passed this past August at the California Democratic Party Executive Board. The supplemental information, that 20-page document that's got just reams of, just basically it's the tip of the iceberg stuff. Look at all these tips. LetAmericaVote.org. Oh, and of course the New York Times video game. That might be fun to play. And then, of course, the Don Siegelman case, freedon.org. That's got a hyphen in there, free-don.org. And that seems to be click to exit presentation. I guess that was it. Was that it? I guess that was it. And I'm going to put this back up here.
Rob!
Okay, I think we're at the Q&A section. Rob, Fred, yes, Fred.
The Brenham Center for Voter Justice, part of NYU, which is doing a lot of work in voter suppression.
Thank you for pointing that out. Now I'm going to point out something to you, Fred. Back on the back side of your agenda, right there at the bottom is the Brennan Center website. Okay, what's our time here? Where do I stand? I'm supposed to be out of here. Hey, I've got 30 minutes, folks. Q&A. Okay, now before we do the Q&A, I'm not an expert in this area. I'm a pissed off Democrat that wanted to push back against the Democratic leadership that was ignoring this issue and allowing Trump to get elected. But I don't consider myself a real expert in this area. So some of the questions you ask, I'm going to just kind of say, hey, I don't know about that. Transportation, that's my expertise. If you want to ask about transportation issues during this, I'd be happy to respond to those. But let's start off, and I think what we'll do is switch mics. How's this one doing? Oh, this one's not nearly as good as that one is, so let's do this one. Okay, so this guy is going into here. Let's bring up number 5. Is that, whoop, oh, wait a minute. God, it works so much better when you turn it on. Okay, let's see here. I may want to do this just in case. Okay, we're going to drop this one. Okay, we're good? Hey, that would be wonderful. That would be great. Thank you, Craig.
I'll run the mic too.
Okay. I think the guy there on the left had his hand up first. No, not that guy, the guy behind him. Brent will be next. I know he wants to talk.
I'll make it quick. I have a question, and I've had this for years. Those of us in this room, many of us are critical of the National Committee, for obvious reasons. But my question to you, and I don't know if you have the answer or anyone in the room has an answer, I have a couple questions. First question, how often does the Democratic National Committee meet as an organization?
As an organization. Does anybody in the audience know the answer to this question?
Twice a year.
Twice a year, says Brent. Okay, next question.
So the second part of that is, at those meetings, who is in attendance? Are there members from every single state based on population? Who's sitting in those meetings?
I think the short answer is yes. There are people from everywhere because they're all kind of delegates. We've got folks elected from each, certainly each state, and I think each congressional district. Is there anybody else that knows the better answer to that question?
Isn't it the county? In California, it's each county.
Each county, you think, has a representative to the DNC? Maybe not.
The county central committee has a representative.
The county central committee has a representative to the DNC, so that means one per county, I guess. Otto Lee is ours from this county.